have a little confession to make. But I think first of all, we'll turn to a story in 2 Samuel and chapter 24. 2 Samuel chapter 24. Now, David wanted to know how powerful he was. And so he called in Joab, and I'm going to read from verse 2. The king said to Joab and the army commanders with him, "Go throughout the tribes of Israel from Dan to Beersheba, and enroll the fighting men so that I may know how many there are." So he wants to know how strong are they. Joab replied to the king, "May the Lord your God multiply the troops 100 times over. May the eyes of my lord the king see it. But why does my lord the king want to do such a thing?" Joab had the good sense to realize that the king should rely on the Lord and not on the size of his army. King's word, however, overruled Joab and the army commander, so they left the presence of the king to enroll the fighting men of Israel. However, when the results came in, the king realized he'd made a mistake, and he felt conscience-stricken. Verse 10, David was conscience-stricken after he counted the fighting men, and he said to the Lord, "I have sinned greatly in what I've done. Now, Lord, I beg you, take away the guilt of your servant. I've done a very foolish thing." Well, before he got up the next morning, a prophet called Gad came to him with a message. And the message is this: "Shall there come on you 3 years of famine in your land, 3 months of fleeing from your enemies, or 3 days of plague in your land? You decide." Very wisely, the king said, "No, I'll let the Lord decide." And so there was the plague. Reading on, verse 16, when the angel stretched out his hand to destroy Jerusalem, the Lord relented concerning the disaster, and said to the angel who was afflicting the people, "Enough, withdraw your hand." The angel of the Lord was then at the threshing floor of Araunah the Jebusite. When David saw the angel who was striking down the people, he said to the Lord, "I have sinned. I, the shepherd, have done wrong." So then he wants to know, what can he do? On that day, Gad went to David and said to him, "Go and build an altar to the Lord on the threshing floor of Araunah the Jebusite." So David went up as the Lord had commanded through Gad. When Araunah looked and saw the king and his officials coming toward him, he went out and bowed down before the king with his face to the ground. Araunah said, "Why has my lord the king come to his servant?" "To buy your threshing floor," David answered, "so that I can build an altar to the Lord, that the plague on the people may be stopped." Araunah said to David, "Let my lord the king take whatever he wishes and offer it up. Here are oxen for the burnt offering. Here are the threshing sledges and the ox yokes for the wood. Your Majesty," Araunah gives all this to the king. Araunah also said to him, "May the Lord your God accept you." But the king replied to Araunah, "No, I insist on paying you for it. I will not sacrifice to the Lord my God burnt offerings that cost me nothing." So David bought the threshing floor and the oxen and paid 50 shekels of silver for them. David built an altar to the Lord there and sacrificed burnt offerings and fellowship offerings. Then the Lord answered his prayer on behalf of the land, and the plague on Israel was stopped. So where's the confession? Well, for years, I pictured David going along, and either he or one of his officials fishing out a purse and counting out 50 shekels, 50 coins, to pay Araunah for his threshing floor. and I could not have been more wrong, because they didn't have coins back then. If you went out and you bought something, you either took little ingots of gold or silver or perhaps bronze, or you took other goods to barter. But you certainly didn't take coins. And I should have known it, because it's as plain as a pikestaff when you turn to Genesis. Genesis chapter 23 and verse 14 on. You remember how Abraham went to live in the promised land, but he didn't own any of it. One day his wife Sarah died, and Abraham needed somewhere where he could bury her. Now, it says in verse 7, Abraham rose and bowed down before the people of the land, the Hittites, and said to them, if you're willing to, let me bury my dead. If you're willing to let me bury my dead, then listen to me and intercede with Ephron, son of Zohar, on my behalf, so that he will sell me the cave of Machpelah, which belongs to him and is at the end of his field. Ask him to sell it to me for the full price as a burial site among you. So there's the solution to the problem. If Ephron will agree, then Abraham will have somewhere to bury his dead wife. Well, Ephron did agree. Verse 14, Ephron answered Abraham, listen to me, my lord. The land is worth 400 shekels of silver, but what is that between you and me? Bury your dead. Abraham agreed to Ephron's terms and weighed out for him the price he had named in the hearing of the Hittites, 400 shekels of silver, according to the weight current among the merchants. So there you've got the clue. When you paid for something, you weighed out something. It's the same word in the Hebrew. You had no coins whatever. By the way, when you make a mistake like that, it's good to have an excuse up your sleeve. So my excuse is this. I used to collect stamps from Palestine. And on some of them they have coins. And underneath it has shekels. So I said to myself, aha, shekel equals coin. Well, it might do, but not back in the time of Abraham and Sarah. In fact, you can read right through to the last mention of shekels in the Old Testament, which is in the book of Amos, and it still means a weight and not a coin. Well, this lack of coinage was rather inconvenient, and it all changed when the small but very wealthy merchant nation of Lydia invented coins. They were the first to do it. Now, they had to make coins out of something. What should they use? Well, there's a naturally occurring mixture of gold and silver called electrum. So the first coins were made of a mixture of gold and silver. But within 100 years, they decided that it would be better if they separated out the gold and silver. So now coins would be either gold or silver, but in any case, all the coins would be in the name of the king of Lydia. And by the way, this pattern of issuing coins in the name of the country's leader has persisted even to this day. We still have the royal mint, even though the Queen may not own it. Well, that was around the year 640 that coins came on, but rolling on 100 years, we come to a gentleman called Cyrus, Cyrus the Great. You remember he's mentioned in the book of Daniel. He was the head of the Medo-Persian Empire and decided he would like to increase the size of his empire. And so he gobbled up, as it were, Asia Minor. And that included Lydia. So now Lydia was just a province of the Medo-Persians. And they thought, yeah, coins are a good idea. So the Medo-Persians also issued coins, but they did something new. They put a picture of the king on the front. And so for the first time in the world's history, you had coins with pictures of the issuing king. So when you read the story in Ezra 2 of how some of the Jews returned from Medo-Persia, from the Babylonian captivity, and took with them some 61,000 drachmas of gold for the rebuilding of the temple, they were actually gold darics. And if you read a modern version, it doesn't say drachmas, it actually says gold darics. So the gold went back to the promised land, and they were able to help build or rebuild the temple. After the Medes and Persians, you remember, came the Greeks, and they continued this matter of issuing gold and silver coins in the name of the current ruler. And after then came the Romans. But the Romans did something different. Whereas before all coins were in the name of the king and minted in the name of the king, the Romans said, we have conquered a lot of people. We will let them issue their own bronze coins. Silver and gold, the Romans issued. The bronze coins, other nations could issue. Now, this was very helpful to the Jews, because as you can imagine, no self-respecting Jew wanted to handle money with a graven image on the front. So the Jews could now have a coinage which did not offend their religious principles. However, the Jews weren't very good at making their own coins. Many Jewish coins had jagged edges, which may explain a comment of Jesus when he was talking about where you lay up treasure, which is in heaven. And he said, provide purses for yourself which will not wear out. Now, I've got a purse at home. I've had it for donkey's years and it hasn't worn out. That's because the coins have got nice smooth edges. But back then, a leather purse with half a dozen bronze coins with jagged edges on them would very soon wear out, and you'd get a hole in your purse as a result. Now, why all this about coins? Because coins in the Bible were used to try and trap Jesus. That's the special interest that Christians have in coins. The first occasion occurred in the autumn of AD 30, and the story is found in Matthew 17 to 24. And by the way, in this story, there's a good example of how you can get something extra by trying to imagine what actually happened. So we'll start with Matthew 17 and verses 24 and 25. After Jesus and his disciples arrived in Capernaum, the collectors of the 2 drachma temple tax came to Peter and asked, "Doesn't your teacher pay the temple tax?" And without thinking, Peter replies, "Yes, he does." When Peter came into the house, Jesus was the first to speak. "What do you think, Simon?" he asked. "From whom do the kings of the earth collect duty and taxes, from their own children or from others?" "From others," Peter answered. "Then the children are exempt," Jesus said to him. "But so that we may not cause offense, go to the lake and throw out your line. Take the first fish you catch, open its mouth, and you'll find a 4 drachma coin. Take it and give it to them for my tax and yours." So that's the story so far. It was ridiculous to think that Jesus, the Son of God, should help pay for the temple which was used for the worship of God. And Peter eventually says, "Yeah, I get it." Now let's roll it back a bit. these temple tax collectors come to Peter and say, "Does your master pay the tax?" "Yes, he does." "Just half a mo, I'll go and get it." So he goes into the house, not to speak to Jesus, but to speak to Judas, who carries the purse. However, before he can say a word, Jesus asks him this question: who should really be paying it? And Peter suddenly has a flash of enlightenment, and he comes out of the house without the money. So now he's outside, and the temple tax collector says something like this: "Well, have you got it?" "No." "I thought you said he would pay." "Oh, yes, he will. But you haven't got it." "No." "Well, when's he going to get it?" "He isn't." "So he isn't going to pay it?" "Well, yes, he is actually, but not to get it from him, I'm to get it from a fish." And they say, "You're kidding." And he says, "Oh no, the master told me to go down to the lake and a fish would provide the coin. And you expect us to come with it?" "Well, if you want the money, yes." And so they go down to the fish. He throws in the line. Very conveniently, a fish swims out, opens its mouth, and lo and behold, there's the coin. So as I say, this is an excellent story to show the benefit of thinking it through. What actually happened? It's not in the Bible, but you know, yep, that's almost certainly, almost word for word what happened. And I can imagine them going away and saying, "That was a tricky one, that was." But Peter, once he got the money, was able to hand it over and make payment in full without denying the divinity of Jesus. And he has escaped the first trap. The second occasion came on the Tuesday of Passion Week. That is, around the spring of AD 31. And for this we need a bit more background about Roman coins especially. When Julius Caesar came to Rome, conquered it, threw out the Senate, it was a relief to the people because there had been a lot of corruption at high level before. And people at first really appreciated what Caesar did. And they began talking about him. They went so far as to start saying, "You know, there's a touch of the divine about Caesar." Well, you remember that Caesar was murdered, and then you had the first of the Roman emperors. And the first of the Roman emperors decided that this talk about a touch of the divinity, it would be a good thing to put it on his coins. So from that time on, coins were issued with the picture of the emperor, but also would have something like Caesar, divine son. Now that would make any Roman coins doubly obnoxious to your true Jew. Well, let's have a look at Luke chapter 20, and I'm going to read verse 19 first of all. Chapter 20, verse 19. Says there, "The teachers of the law and the chief priests looked for a way to arrest him immediately because they knew he'd spoken this parable against them, but they were afraid of the people." What parable? What's the parable of the vineyard where the owner goes off and expects to receive a share of the crop? The owner doesn't get it. In fact, one after another of the servants are beaten up, and finally he sends his son saying, well, they'll respect him, but they don't. They kill the son. And then he says, what will happen? Oh, he will wreak vengeance on them. And so the teachers of the law and the priests, they understood this parable was about them, and they don't like it, and so they look for a way to arrest him and put an end to him. Keeping a close watch on him, they sent spies who pretended to be sincere, that they might catch him in something he said, so as to deliver him up to the authority and jurisdiction of the governor. Teacher, we know that you speak and teach what is right, and that you do not show partiality, but teach the way of God in accordance with the truth. Is it right for us to pay taxes to Caesar or not? What they're doing, they're setting him up and ascribing to him sufficient authority so that whatever he says, they'll be able to hand him over to the governor. And the governor was, of course, Pilate. And one of Pilate's responsibilities was to collect taxes for the Roman emperor. If we turn to Mark 12, verse 15, you'll find they had a second question. Well, should we pay or shouldn't we? They're not going to let him get away easily. They were going to put him on the spot. And it's quite clear that they were prepared to wait for an answer. Whatever he said, they hoped to discredit him. If he said yes, then he would be seen to be supporting Roman taxation, but worse than that, that tax had to be paid in silver coins called denarius, but also known as tribute money. And that tribute money, most likely the coin was the one issued by Tiberius, in which case it would have on there a picture of Tiberius and also the inscription, Caesar Augustus Tiberius, son of the divine Augustus. It would be anathema to the Jews on three accounts. First, they had to pay a tax, but more importantly, it had a graven image and a claim of the emperor for divinity. So declaring that the Jews should pay taxes to Caesar with coins such as this would lose him a lot of credibility. But on the other hand, if he said, no, you don't have to pay it, that would be enough to bring a charge before Pilate. And Pilate would no doubt deal with him severely. So you go back to Matthew chapter 22. And verse 18. But Jesus, knowing their evil intent, said, you hypocrite, why are you trying to trap me? Show me the coin used for paying the tax. Now you notice the next word, they brought him. The wording that's used there suggests they didn't actually have a coin on them. They had to go and get one. They brought him a coin, a denarius, and he asked them, whose image is this? Well, that would be a slap in the face for a start. But then he makes them read, and whose inscription? Caesar's, they replied. Then he said to them, so give back to Caesar what is Caesar's, and to God what is God's. When they heard this, they were amazed, so they left him and they went away. It's ironic that they tried to trap him using a coin that bore the portrait of a man who claimed divinity, while standing before them was a person bearing the portrait of his father and actually possessing divinity. They should have refused by their own standards to handle the coin. Instead, they rejected Jesus. But on this occasion, they failed to trap him. But that didn't mean that they were ready to give up. So if you turn a few more pages to chapter 26, you come to the next story. Chapter 26, Matthew 26, when Jesus had finished saying all these things, verse 1, he said to his disciples, as you know, the Passover is 2 days away, and the Son of Man will be handed over to be crucified. Then the chief priests and the elders of the people assembled in the palace of the high priest, whose name was Caiaphas. And they schemed to arrest Jesus secretly and kill him, but not during the festival, they said, or there may be a riot among the people. So Jesus has told his disciples, look, I'm likely to die very soon. The high priests are busy trying to find a way. But read on, verse 6. While Jesus was in Bethany in the home of Simon the leper, a woman came to him with an alabaster jar of very expensive perfume, which she poured on his head while he was reclining at table. I've no doubt whatever that she meant to do this as a very private act of devotion, but she seems to have overlooked the fact that this ointment was highly perfumed and the fragrance would immediately fill the room. So keep your hand in Matthew 26 while you turn to John chapter 12 and then have a look at verses 4 to 6. But one of his disciples, oh, by the way, verse 3 says, the house was filled with the fragrance of the perfume. Verse 4, but one of his disciples, Judas Iscariot, who was later to betray him, objected, why wasn't this perfume sold and the money given to the poor? It was worth a year's wages. If any of you gentlemen ever decide to make a special gift to your wife, here's one way to impress. Just go out and spend a year's wages. I guess she would be impressed. It was worth a year's wages. He did not say this because he cared about the poor, but because he was a thief. As keeper of the money bag, he used to help himself to what was put into it. So the lady in question is criticised quite publicly. Now remember, ladies at a feast were there to serve, not to attract attention to themselves. She'd done so unwittingly, and then Judas had made it even worse. At which point, Jesus said, leave her alone. It was intended that she should save this perfume for the day of my burial. You will always have the poor among you, but you will not always have me. So now Judas is rebuked, and the lady is thanked for what she's done. Now go back to Matthew 26 and verse 14. What happened next? Well, Judas has time to think about what has happened, and he decides he's going to do something. Verse 14, then one of the 12, the one called Judas Iscariot, went to the chief priests and asked, what are you willing to give me if I deliver him over to you? Remember, this is all within the space of this festival. It's all happening within a very few days. And asked, what are you willing to give me if I deliver him over to you? So they counted out for him 30 pieces of silver. From then on, Judas watched for an opportunity to hand him over. Those priests, the religious leaders, who tried so hard for so long to entrap Jesus, must have thought this was their lucky day. They could never have dreamt that one day one of his inner circle would come along and offer to betray him. They had already planned and plotted, how can we capture him on the quiet? Their problem was he was a very popular man, and with the festival especially, there was no way they could do it. And then along comes Judas, and they count out for him 30 silver pieces. These pieces were each worth about 4 days' work. So the value of what they gave him was about 120 days of labour. I've no doubt that at the time he thought he'd been clever and struck a bargain, but in actual fact it was without any shadow of doubt, the worst bargain of all eternity. He should have held out for at least 1,000,000 talents of gold. 30 pieces of silver was nothing when you think of it. Why did he do it? No doubt for a number of reasons. One I've already implied, that he was told off by Jesus. Another one, without doubt, was the one mentioned in 1 Timothy 6 verse 10, where it says, the love of money is a root of all kinds of evil. And we know that Judas was tempted that way. We've already read it in John earlier. And against all the odds, he did it. You would have thought that someone who had listened to Jesus, been chosen by Jesus, been set aside by Jesus, had watched Jesus work miracles, would have had more sense. But he did it anyway. And it led to Jesus this time being caught, tried, scourged, crucified, all for 30 pieces of silver. The love of money was that strong. Could Jesus have walked away from this trap too? Undoubtedly. And in fact, while Pilate was asking him that very question, he said, oh yes, I only have to say the word, and the Father will send an angel or two, and that will be that. But the world was about to learn a valuable lesson. There is a stronger love than the love of money, and it is known as the love of God. Judas could have his 30 silver coins for all the good that it did him. But Jesus would complete his mission to this world by dying for us and then rising again from the tomb. For God had found a way to save humanity, and no coin of the realm could ever do that. Only Jesus himself, who also made payment in full. And for that, we will be eternally grateful. Amen.